Did you know that after Jesus' death, the whole world seems to have reacted in ways that still make us question the reality of what happened? 5 mysterious events marked the end of their crucifixion, and the most surprising of all, the one that few know could completely change his view of Christ's death and resurrection. These events are not just historical accounts. They are powerful manifestations that speak directly to our hearts, inviting us to reflect on our own journey of faith and salvation. If you thought you knew all the details of the Passion of Christ, get ready to find out something that will touch your perception of what really happened at that historic moment. Curious to know more? Let us exploit these mysteries together, one by one, and see how each of them leads us to better understand the greatness of Jesus' sacrifice. Jesus' death was one of the most striking moments in history, but few realize that it didn't end there. Something extraordinary happened soon after. Imagine witnessing an earthquake that makes the rocks depart. See tombs opening before your eyes and witness an inexplicable darkness covering the earth on the day. This is not film scene, they're recorded events, full of meaning and mystery. But what does all this mean? Was nature react to the sacrifice of the Son of God? What's more, why even a Roman centurion, trained for brutality, trembled by recognizing something that many refuse to accept? Get ready to discover 5 events that have changed the course of humanity and can transform your view of redemption, judgment, and salvation. The last of them, few know, but carries a deep meaning. The moment Jesus delivered his spirit was not just an isolated event. The earth itself seemed to shudder in response. An earthquake shook the region, departing rocks and shaking the foundations of the temple. Imagine being there, feeling the floor shake under your feet, watching buildings oscillate and listening to a crash that echoed through the mountains. It was not a simple natural phenomenon, but a powerful sign creation recognized the impact of that sacrifice. This earthquake was not a chance. In biblical tradition, land tremors often accompany divine manifestations. From Mount Sinai, where God handed the law to Moses, until the reports of the apocalypse, the earth trembled in times of great spiritual importance. Here the shake marked the end of an era, the end of the old sacrifices, and the beginning of a new covenant. The earth, as if it felt the loss, ripped into pain, witnessing the grandeur of that moment. But did this earthquake only affect the ground? It was not only stone that broke, but also hearts. Imagine the Roman soldiers, accustomed to brutality, seeing themselves before something that fled from human control. The tremor announced that this was not an ordinary man, and even the most skeptical could feel the weight of what had just happened. Divine judgment and mercy walked side by side, and even nature seemed to proclaim it. And if the earth trembled at that time, do we still tremble at this sacrifice today? How many times are we shaken by moments that make us rethink everything? Just as the earthquake shook Jerusalem, certain truths shake our certainties. But in the midst of all this, there is redemption. This tremor did not come to destroy, but to awaken us. And the question that remains is, are we aware of what he still tells us? If the earthquake was once an amazing event, what happened next was even more surprising. Tombs opened, and many saints who had died returned to life. Imagine walking through Jerusalem and suddenly find someone who had been dead for years, a grandfather, a prophet of the past, someone whose story seemed closed. This event was not just a curious detail. He carried a deep meaning about the resurrection and victory over death. But why did these saints come back to life? This was not just an isolated miracle, but a preview of what was coming. Jesus did not just come to pay the price of sin, but to overcome death once and for all. The resurrection of these people was a living testimony of this promise. It was as if God was showing, visibly and undeniable, that death would no longer have the final word. Those open tombs would harbinger the greatest resurrection of all, that of Christ. The impact of this event was immense. Jerusalem was full of pilgrims, and the news spread quickly. Many, who once doubted, began to question their beliefs. Who could deny that something extraordinary was happening? The veil itself between the natural and the supernatural seemed to have torn itself, and those who returned to life were proof that the message of Jesus was not just words, it was real power, which transcended death and time. And if at that time people came out of the tombs, What does it teach us today? How many of us live as dead inside, trapped in past pain, without hope? This event reminds us that the resurrection is not only physical, but also spiritual. We can get out of our own tombs of hopelessness and live. The question is, are we ready for this? Just as Jesus died, something extraordinary happened within the Temple of Jerusalem. The veil that separated the saint of the saints was torn from top to bottom. This detail may seem just a strange phenomenon, but for those who understood its meaning, it was a historical and spiritual milestone. That veil was not any curtain. He symbolized a barrier between God and humanity. Only the high priest could cross it, and yet once a year under rigorous rituals. Suddenly, this separation was eliminated. This tear was not human work. If the veil had been torn from the bottom up, someone could argue that it was a man's action, but it was from top to bottom a direct action of God, stating that access to his presence was now open. No more intermediate or constant sacrifices were needed. The perfect sacrifice had already been made. Redemption was complete, and anyone could come to God without fear, no barriers, no complicated rituals. Imagine the impact of this on the religious priests and leaders of the time. The structure of the temple, which represented the entire worship system, now had an irreversible breach. What was once exclusive to the few was now accessible to everyone. What would they do to this new reality? Would they ignore the sign and continue as if nothing had happened? Or would they recognize that something much bigger had been inaugurated? That was the question that everyone needed to face. And this question continues to us today. Do we still live as if there was a veil separating us from God? How many times do we create barriers, thinking we are not worthy enough, that we need to improve before we approach Him? The veil has already been torn. The path is open. The question is, let's go through it. Something inexplicable happened that day. From noon to 3 in the afternoon, when the sun should be shining at the height, a deep darkness covered the entire earth. It was not a common eclipse that lasted too long and came at the exact moment Jesus agonized on the cross. Imagine being there, seeing the day transform suddenly, feeling the weight of that mysterious shadow. It was as if the creation itself was lamenting what happened. But this darkness was not just a natural phenomenon. In biblical tradition, darkness often represented divine judgment. In Egypt, before the Exodus, one of the pests was a total darkness. Here was a sign that something grand was ongoing. God was dealing with the sin of humanity once and for all. The cross was not just a physical suffering for Jesus, but a moment of separation when He carried the weight of everyone's guilt. The impact was overwhelming. People who mocked began to shut up. The soldiers used the brutal executions, looked at the sky with restlessness. Religious leaders who asked for Jesus' death become the sun to disappear, and deep down have wondered, did we make a terrible mistake? That moment was a divine answer that no one could ignore. And today, how many times do we feel this darkness in our lives? Moments when it seems that everything crumbles, that God is distant, that there's no way out. But just like that dark afternoon, the light would shine again. Darkness may have lasted 3 hours, but it was not the end of the story. And the question that remains is, are we willing to wait for the light that comes later? Among all the people who witnessed the crucifixion, an unexpected man was the first to recognize something extraordinary. A Roman centurion, trained for brutality, used at executions, he was not easily impressible. But after seeing the earthquake, the darkness, and everything that happened, he could no longer deny. Before the body of Jesus hanging on the cross, he pronounced one of the most powerful statements. Truly, this was the Son of God. What made the soldier change his posture? He saw many die, but never in such a way. He heard Jesus cry out to the Father, "Forgive those who hurt him, and deliver his spirit voluntarily." Nothing in the scene followed the pattern of a common execution. The suffering was real, but it was not a defeated one. It was from someone who fulfilled a purpose. This was enough to shake even a heart hardened by war and violence. This testimony was not just a personal confession, but a reflection of the universal impact of the cross. The gospel was not just for the Jews or the faithful followers of Jesus. He even reached a Roman soldier, a representative of the oppressive power of that time. If even a man trained to kill managed to see the truth, what does this mean to us? Who is really willing to see beyond appearances? And that same question echoes to this day. How many times God gives us signs, but are we slow to recognize them? The centurion had to see everything crumble to understand who Jesus was. But do we need to wait for earthquakes, darkness, and chaos to see the obvious? Or can we recognize now that he remains the Son of God? The story of these 5 events is not just a distant account. It continues to resonate to this day. Every detail, from the earthquake to the centurion's confession, reveals something deep about judgment, mercy, and redemption. But the big question is not just what happened at that time, but what it means to you now. If even the earth trembled, the tombs opened, and the veil torn, how can we remain indifferent? What does this story awaken to you? Are there barriers that still need to be knocked down? Perhaps there are areas in your life where the light has not yet shone completely. The centurion recognized Jesus after seeing everything crumble, but do you have to wait for the chaos to see what is already before your eyes? The answer to the greatest dilemma of humanity has always been there, the cross. The question is whether we are ready to accept it. If this content brought you important reflections, don't stop here. Keep exploring, seeking knowledge and deepening your understanding of these mysteries. And not to lose anything, subscribe to the channel, enable notifications, and follow more content like this. The next can bring an answer you didn't even know you needed.